Okay, this video is primarily for the lower six group that I teach on my own, but for the upper six students, you also need to know this stuff as well. And the material in question is market-based supply-side policies, which is on the specification, it's 2.6.3. So let's get straight into this. So market-based supply-side policies. Well, a supply-side policy is one that's designed to shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. That's what supply-side policies do. As the name suggests, they're designed first and foremost to increase the level of aggregate supply in the economy. And your go-to diagram, I think, for a market-based supply-side policy would be this one here. So you can see the aggregate supply curve shifting to the right, and you can see an increase in the equilibrium level of GDP and a fall in the average price level. Basically the classical school favour market-based supply-side policies because they believe in small government. And market-based supply-side policies do not need increases in government spending to work. And by work I mean to shift output at general equilibrium, to shift the long run AS to the right. Yeah, and as you saw on that diagram there, just one more time, that top one, you can see that you also get some benign deflation too. Just as a practical tip, you might just want to pause the video at various points to look at the diagram and maybe make a note of it yourself. I'll also forward onto you some typed up notes on the same topic, so one way or another you'll have plenty to revise from when you start looking at this topic. Okay, so let's talk about each of these market-based supply-side policies. So the first one is, number one, is reforming the tax and benefit system. So what does that mean? Well, the goal of this policy is to increase the incentive to work. If you can get either people who are working part-time to work full-time, or maybe people who, let's put it this way, are voluntarily unemployed. They one reason or another, they're quite happy claiming benefits. I'm not saying everybody's in this position, but maybe some are. If you can get people who are currently economically inactive to start actively seeking work, then what that will do is increase the supply of labour, as this diagram shows there. So the increase in the supply of labour, I'm just thinking about the focus, yeah, that looks okay, will shift the supply of labour to the right. What that does is it causes the equilibrium level of employment to increase from E1 to E2. The increase in the equilibrium level of employment across the macroeconomy will lead to an increase in output at general equilibrium. And that's why reforming the tax and benefit system will shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right, creating long-run economic growth. And notice also there's some benign deflation there, which is really good for poor people, because even if they don't get nominal wage increases, a lower price level, a fall in the cost of living, that's what deflation is, will actually really benefit those poor people, because their wages will enable them to buy more stuff if the price level falls. Okay, so talking about this, so what sort of things could you do to the tax system? I think the best marks always go to students who can apply in context. So at the moment, the tax threshold in Britain is about £12,500 a year. So if you earn less than that, you don't pay any tax at all. What you might decide to do is to increase that tax threshold to 20,000. That might encourage somebody who's maybe at home computer gaming and can't be really bothered to work and is just living off their parents' money. Maybe it'll encourage them to get off their backside, switch off the computer and go and get a job. And if that happens, then we'll get an increase in the supply of labour and output at general equilibrium will rise. Alternatively, what we could do is reduce the basic rate of tax. At the moment, most people pay tax at 20%. If we reduce that to, in Russia, for example, they have a flat tax on income of 13%. I'm sure that would incentivize people to maybe work harder, do more hours. From my point of view, I probably would start doing some examining in the summer if that was the case. Obviously, the welfare state, I think with tax credits, those are top-ups that the government gives to people who are primarily in part-time work. And what it basically does is it encourages people to choose to work part-time rather than to work full-time. Good for them, bad for the taxpayer, bad for the economy. Okay, so if you wanted to evaluate that supply side policy, why might it not work? Well, maybe you could say that if you could cut taxes, you could cut welfare spending, but maybe it'll just take a very long time for people's cultural attitudes to change. You've created a welfare dependency class, and there could be political opposition to cutting benefits. It might be very difficult for a politician to get that one through Parliament. And also if you cut taxes a little bit, there might be still some people that they've not got the skills that they need to successfully enter the labour market. And maybe, I suppose this is definitely true, deindustrialisation has just reduced the number of jobs, high-paid jobs, that are available. So yeah, you could try and create incentives, but if there aren't many firms out there because they've been offshored, then just tweaking incentives by changing the tax and benefit system, it might increase the supply of labour, but there might not be much demand for labour because we've offshored a lot of what was UK manufacturing. Okay, moving on to the second market-based supply side policy, quite a simple one. Immigration, so you could run a very relaxed immigration policy. The UK, even before Brexit, after Brexit, whatever, I don't think things will change very much at all. So we import people. What that does, again, is it increases the supply of labour, it increases the level of employment, and that in turn will increase output at general equilibrium, and the LRAS shifts to the right. That's the primary effect. So let's talk a little bit about this one. What would it depend on? Well, obviously the magnitude of the immigration, but also critically the quality of the labour that you import. At this point, I just want to remind you again that do not conflate productivity, which is output per worker, with production. There's still way too many students that do that, and you must stop it. I know productivity sounds sophisticated, but don't use it when you're really referring to production. So in this case, I am definitely talking about output per worker. I am definitely talking about productivity. If you run a selective immigration policy like Australia, you can import people who've got the skills that you need. You can import high quality labour. Sorry about that. And that will drag up the average output per worker across the whole country. And if the average level of productivity goes up, then the UK's total production will increase. The long run AS will shift to the right. So that's immigration. I guess in terms of why it might not work, again, you can import people, but are there firms? Are there enough firms in Britain who can soak up those people that you're importing? If not, they may end up being unemployed. They may end up displacing Brits from the labour market because they'll work longer for less pay. What else? Yeah, just a shortage of firms. If there's a shortage of firms, a shortage of employers, you can import all the people that you want to, and it might not create much of an output boost. Okay, so that's number 2. Third market-based supply-side policy is reducing the rate of corporation tax. Corporation tax is a tax on company profits. You need to know that. So what's the logic chain here? How does a cut in corporation tax lead to an increase in the economy's long-run aggregate supply curve? The answer is pretty simple. Firms use retained profit to invest. So if you cut corporation tax, firms will have more cash available that they can use to purchase new capital equipment. That new capital equipment will increase the productive capacity of the economy, and therefore the long-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. Again, just one more time, that'll happen. So that's just fairly obvious. I guess also as well, there would be an incentive effect for firms to try and make more profit in the first place if they weren't being taxed so aggressively. You could also argue that a low rate of corporation tax might encourage inward foreign direct investment into Britain. So firms that are looking to maximise profit might choose to come and build a factory in Britain because by operating here, they'll pay less tax than they would do somewhere else, like in France or Germany maybe. So that's definitely something that you could do. In terms of why might it not work, well, there could be other supply side problems in the UK. Poor business confidence, or maybe badly educated workforce. So even if you cut the rate of corporation tax, that might not be enough to stimulate more private sector investment. The next one is privatisation. So let's explain what that term means first. So privatisation is the transfer of public sector assets to the private sector. So I grew up in the 1980s observing a lot of the privatisations that took place. So when I was your age, British Telecom, British Airways, British Gas, and many other famous names were public corporations or nationalised industries. They were owned and controlled by the state. The state employed central planners to run those nationalised industries for the public good. That was the official line anyway. Okay, so in the 1980s and 1990s, the government decided to sell off those nationalised industries, and they mostly did that by selling shares to ordinary people. So you converted a nationalised industry, a public corporation, into a private limited company, or a public limited company, a privately owned company. Most of them were on the stock market, so a public limited company. Okay, so that's what privatization is. We now need to explain how privatization might increase long run aggregate supply. So let's think about that. Um, the first argument is that if a business is privately owned, it will be more efficient than a nationalised industry. Why? Well, the simple answer is nationalised industries don't need to make a profit to survive because they've always got the taxpayer standing behind them. Theoretically, that isn't the case for a public limited company. Public limited companies or any private business have to make a profit to survive. If they don't, they go out of business. And this fear of failure inspires both managers and workers to be more efficient. They'll try to maximise productivity. So, for example, British Telecom, when it was privatised, it shed about 40% of its workforce, but BT's output actually increased. So what you've got a situation there is skyrocketing productivity. One more time, output per worker, because output increased at a time when the workforce fell. So output per worker rose. So if you change the sectoral balance of our mixed economy away from the public sector towards the private sector, the theory is that that will increase output per worker. So the same number of workers will now be able to produce more in total, and that will increase long-run aggregate supply. So it's a market-based supply-side policy. It's market-based because it doesn't require an increase in government spending to work. This is the crucial bit. Immigration doesn't need an increase in government spending to work. What was the first one? Reforming the tax and benefit system. Actually, reforming the benefit system normally involves cutting government spending. So market-based supply-side policies, crucially, do not need increases in government spending to work. And that's why the new classical school love these sorts of policies, because they believe in small government. Okay, so yeah, also on the privatisation point, shareholders have invested their own money into private companies. So they're pretty tough taskmasters. The managers that they appoint to run their company on their behalf, if they're not doing a very good job, they'll fire them. And that forces those companies to be efficient. Some people refer to this phenomenon by the term top-down competition. In contrast, the central planners running nationalised industries, they only have to please politicians, and politicians won't be anywhere near as tough as taskmasters, because politicians have got no financial skin in the game. It's not their money that's invested into nationalised industries, it's just the stupid taxpayers. Anyway, shouldn't laugh because it's serious. Okay, right, so what's the next one? So we're on to now what, policy 5? So policy 5 is deregulation. Deregulation, if we wanted to define it, is removing legal barriers to entry from a micro market. So that sounds a bit jargony, but what that basically means is just make it easier for new firms to join a market by removing unnecessary rules and regulations. How does this work? Well, basically, if you relax regulation, the firms that are already in that market have got a much greater incentive to become efficient. If they're protected by excessive government regulation that keeps rivals out, they've got much less incentive to reform their business to make it more efficient. So deregulation, again, it works. It increases long-run aggregate supply by increasing productivity, and the productivity goes up because firms have got to try to become more efficient, because they're now operating within a micro market that's more competitive. because those legal barriers to entry that surround their market have been removed. So that's deregulation. Those on the political left would have a fit at the thought of deregulation, because they'd say, well, the opportunity cost of deregulating, it's not a price that's worth paying. You know, if it's environmental regulations that you're getting rid of, then there'll be more negative externalities produced, and that will reduce the quality of environmental goods and the non-material quality of life. If it's labour laws, you know, laws relating to hiring and firing workers, again, those on the political left would say deregulating labour markets might be good for long-run aggregate supply, but what about the workers? What about the low paid? What about insecurity? It might not create a good result for society as a whole. Inequality could increase, for example. So you could have growth, but it's not particularly desirable growth, because the deregulation, by hitting the low paid, making their jobs more insecure, it's damaged them. Yeah, there's some merit to that argument, I think. Okay, so what else have we got? Another one is removing minimum wages. So I'll just show you a minimum wage diagram, which I drew earlier. Hold that one up there. Hold it still. So, as you remember, for a minimum wage to be effective, it needs to be set above the market clearing wage rate. So again, don't be afraid to just pause the video, or maybe just draw it out yourself, and then I can describe it to you. So basically, the minimum wage means that there's an excess supply in the labour market of E1 to E2. If you abolish the minimum wage, then the people that are currently unemployed at the minimum wage would knock on employers' doors and offer themselves to work for a lower wage than the minimum, and the wage rate would fall all the way down until the labour market cleared at a wage of W3. What you'll notice from the diagram is that will cause an increase in the level of employment from E1 to E3, and that increase in the level of employment will increase output at general equilibrium, and it will do this. It will shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right, creating growth. So coming towards the end now, what else have we got? Last one, in fact. So another thing that you could do is trade. You could go for trade liberalisation. What does that mean? Well, trade is liberalised when a country removes protectionist trade barriers such as tariffs and quotas. We've covered that before. If you're not too sure, you can look up both of those terms in the glossary. So that's tariffs, indirect taxes imposed on imports only, and quotas. Quotas are physical limits on the volume of a particular product that are allowed to be imported into a country in a particular year. So what trade liberalisation involves then is ditching protectionism and embracing free trade. If you do that and go for free trade, then domestic firms that have had it easy for way too long inside a domestic market that's protected from the outside world, they'll have become flabby and lazy and inefficient. If they don't really have to face up to tough competition from the rest of the world, why would you expect them to be world-class companies with world-class levels of productivity, world-class levels of output per worker? So if you open up your domestic market to foreign competition by liberalising your foreign trade, then those domestic firms will have to do something. Again, it's the fear of liquidation will force the managers of those companies to adopt different methods of working that are more efficient. maybe paper pushers that they've employed for years, just doing useless meetings about stupid stuff. All of that has to go, and it has to go because if you don't fire those people, you'll go bust. Your cost base will be just too high. So again, what happens is that this time it's foreign competition, the threat of foreign competition will force UK firms into shedding surplus labour. What that will do is increase productivity because the same the same output can be produced with fewer workers, and that will increase the output per worker metric, because basically the denominator's fallen but the numerator stayed the same if you're mathematically minded. So those are basically the market-based supply-side policies. So one more time, their goal is that they increase long-run aggregate supply. They're market-based in that people that believe in these sorts of policies favour small, limited government. They believe in the supremacy of market forces. They believe in Adam Smith's invisible hand. They believe that the output mix of the economy is more likely to match society's tastes and preferences if it's determined from the bottom up through the emergent order of consumer sovereignty, as Hayek would describe it. So these policies, I think these policies would be really great for the UK at the moment because the UK is still running pretty big fiscal deficits. Obviously, let's talk about Krona in a second. The national debt has more than doubled over the last decade, and that's, as you guys know or should know, when you reduce the fiscal deficit, you just reduce the rate of growth of the national debt. So I don't think really the UK has got, our public finances aren't sound enough to support a big round of interventionist supply side policies. But we do need to reform the supply side of our economy. So for me, my own personal feeling is market-based supply-side policies would have been the way to go. Obviously, everything's up in the air at the moment because of the coronavirus. Who knows what's going to happen? Anyway, let's keep smiling, and I'll upload this soon. The last one took 2.5 hours to upload, so here's hoping. All right, take care.